Hello, wonderful people. I hope you guys are all doing well. Before we start, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you like these kind of videos. Also, let us know where you guys are listening from. Okay then, let's begin. Batman has always stood as a pillar of justice and unwavering moral fortitude in the sprawling, crime-ridden streets of Gotham City. His moral code, one that forbids him from taking the life of his enemies, no matter how heinous their crimes, has been an enduring aspect of his character. This code, often seen as a manifestation of Batman's nobility, his commitment to justice, and his distinction from the very criminals he seeks to stop, has been examined and admired by fans and scholars alike. However, beneath the cowl, behind the mysterious billionaire persona of Bruce Wayne, lies a man whose actions and decisions may point towards something much more complex, even troubling. Is it possible that Batman's steadfast moral code is not the result of an idealistic vision of justice, but a mask, a carefully constructed defense mechanism designed to conceal deeper psychological issues? Could it be that Batman's refusal to kill stems not from a sense of ethical purity, but from unresolved trauma and a desperate need for control over his fractured psyche? The answer to these questions may reveal a much darker and more nuanced version of Gotham's beloved vigilante than many have considered. At first glance, Batman's morality appears straightforward, even heroic. He is, after all, a man who has dedicated his life to saving Gotham from the criminals that plague it. He is unwavering in his belief that no matter how evil a person may be, they still deserve the opportunity to stand trial and face justice. This is the cornerstone of his moral code, his belief that the line between hero and villain should never be crossed. He refuses to kill, to stoop to the level of the criminals he fights, even when the temptation is overwhelming. In this sense, Batman seems to be the epitome of the moral high ground, holding to a code that others would dismiss as unrealistic in the face of overwhelming evil. But this apparent nobility raises important questions about Batman's psychology. On the surface, it seems to be the hallmark of a man who has found peace in his trauma, who seeks to balance the scales of justice in memory of the parents he lost in a senseless act of violence. Yet, when we peel back the layers of this code, we begin to see the cracks in Batman's psyche. The rigid adherence to a set of principles, the refusal to kill even when it would seem to be the most practical and effective course of action, points to something deeper. Batman's moral code may be a mask for his trauma, a coping mechanism he has adopted to deal with the profound psychological scars of his past. To understand this, we must first explore the source of Batman's trauma. Bruce Wayne's origin story is one that has been retold countless times. A young boy, helpless and vulnerable, watches as his parents are gunned down in a dark alleyway. This traumatic event leaves an indelible mark on Bruce, shaping his identity and his worldview. The loss of his parents, coupled with the violence of the act, leaves him scarred emotionally and psychologically. However, what is often overlooked in discussions of Batman's trauma is how this event has warped his understanding of justice and morality. From the moment he swears vengeance on the criminal underworld, Batman sets himself on a path that is as much about self-punishment as it is about justice. His unyielding pursuit of criminals is a means of exerting control over the uncontrollable chaos that took his parents away. But this need for control also fuels a fundamental part of Batman's character, his refusal to kill. For Batman, taking a life would mean surrendering to the very chaos that he so desperately seeks to prevent. To kill would be to break his own moral code, to give in to the darkness that consumes him. This refusal to kill, however, might not be the pure moral stance it initially appears to be. Instead, it may be a manifestation of deeper psychological issues. Batman's trauma has created a distorted view of morality, one that is so rigid and inflexible that it may be preventing him from dealing with the trauma in a healthy way. His refusal to kill is not just a moral stance, it is a psychological barrier, a way to distance himself from the very violence that defined his early life. At the heart of this moral code lies a fear. The fear that if Batman were to kill, he would become no better than the criminals he fights. This fear is not just a fear of becoming like the villains he pursues, it is a fear of losing control. Killing would be the ultimate surrender to chaos, to the very force that destroyed his childhood. Batman's moral code, therefore, may not be about upholding a sense of justice, but rather about maintaining control over his fractured identity. This is where the psychological depth of Batman's character comes into focus. His refusal to kill is not just an ethical decision, it is a psychological coping mechanism. It is a way for him to impose structure and order on a world that is fundamentally chaotic and cruel. By refusing to kill, Batman maintains the illusion of control, the illusion that he is in charge of his own destiny. But this illusion is fragile, and beneath the surface lies a man who is constantly battling his own demons. In essence, Batman's moral code is not just a mask of righteousness. It is a mask of psychological survival. It is a way for him to protect himself from the overwhelming grief and fear that threaten to consume him. By adhering to this code, Batman prevents himself from succumbing to the darkness within, a darkness that could easily lead him down a path of self-destruction. His refusal to kill is not an act of moral purity. It is an act of psychological self-preservation. As we dive deeper into the psyche of Batman, it becomes clear that his moral code is not just about justice. It is about maintaining a fragile grip on his own identity. His fear of becoming like the criminals he fights is not just a fear of losing his moral high ground, but a fear of losing himself. The line between hero and villain is razor thin for Batman, and his moral code is the only thing standing between him and the abyss. Batman's refusal to kill is one of the most iconic aspects of his character, but it is also one of the most paradoxical. While it elevates him above the villains he faces, it also sets him apart from his allies, often complicating his relationships with figures like Robin, Commissioner Gordon, and even Alfred. In a world where the stakes are high and the consequences of inaction can be deadly, Batman's adherence to this code is, at times, seen as a liability. This paradox leads us to question whether his moral code is truly a reflection of his psychological stability or whether it is a symptom of deeper, unresolved issues that he has yet to confront. Batman's struggle to maintain his moral high ground can be seen most clearly in his relationship with his greatest adversary, the Joker. The Joker, unlike Batman, is the epitome of chaos, a force that seeks to tear down all societal structures and moral frameworks. In many ways, the Joker represents the very darkness that Batman fears. He is a mirror image of what Batman could become if he were to abandon his moral code. The Joker's constant attempts to provoke Batman into breaking his rule by killing him are not merely about creating chaos. They are about testing the limits of Batman's psychological resilience. The Joker understands, perhaps better than anyone, that Batman's refusal to kill is not just about moral superiority, but about fear. The fear that if Batman were to kill, he would lose his humanity and become just another monster in Gotham's dark underworld. The Joker's role in Batman's life is symbolic of the internal struggle that Batman faces daily. He represents the force of chaos, the same force that destroyed Bruce Wayne's childhood and left him a broken, vigilant man. Yet, despite all the Joker's provocations, Batman holds fast to his code. The question then arises, is this because Batman is truly committed to justice, or is it because the act of refusing to kill is the only thing that keeps him grounded in his own fractured sense of self? It seems that Batman's moral code may not be a simple expression of goodness. Rather, it may be an anchor in a sea of psychological turmoil. A significant part of Batman's psychological makeup can be traced to his early childhood trauma, but the root of his inability to kill is also linked to his fear of what it would mean for him to take a life. The act of killing would not only have practical consequences, but would also serve as a permanent marker of his transformation from hero to villain. For Bruce Wayne, the line between good and evil is not just about the actions of the individual, it is about the identity that the individual builds over time. If Batman were to kill, he might cease to be Batman. He might cease to be the man he has fought so hard to become. In a sense, the refusal to kill is both a moral stance and a psychological defense. It is a way of coping with the overwhelming fear that deep down Batman might be just as damaged as the criminals he seeks to stop. His moral code allows him to believe that there is still hope for redemption, that there is still a clear division between right and wrong. However, this belief is constantly tested by the horrors that Batman witnesses daily. Each act of violence, each life lost in Gotham, serves as a reminder of the darkness that surrounds him and threatens to pull him under. By holding on to his moral code, Batman is not simply avoiding becoming like his enemies, he is protecting himself from the psychological collapse that might occur if he were to embrace the chaos that lies just beneath the surface. The psychological toll of Batman's mission is undeniable. His obsession with Gotham's safety, coupled with his refusal to kill, creates a deep internal conflict. Batman is constantly balancing his need for control with the understanding that the world around him is uncontrollable. His moral code becomes not only a shield against his inner demons, but also a form of self-punishment. He is constantly at war with himself, unable to forgive himself for the loss of his parents, and unable to reconcile his desire for justice with the violent world in which he lives. His refusal to kill, while seemingly a noble choice, may actually be a form of emotional self-harm. It is a way of punishing himself for the perceived failure to protect his parents, even though he knows deep down that he was a child, powerless in that moment. This self-inflicted punishment is further complicated by Batman's isolation. He distances himself from others in a way that reinforces his psychological burdens, while his allies, such as Robin and Alfred, offer support and companionship. Batman continually pushes them away. His inability to form meaningful connections with others is tied to his belief that he must carry the weight of Gotham's safety alone. This isolation, however, only deepens his sense of guilt and despair. By refusing to allow others into his life, Batman not only keeps them safe from the dangers he faces, but also ensures that he never has to confront his deeper psychological wounds. The mask of the Dark Knight becomes a barrier between him and any chance of healing. At the heart of Batman's psychology is a desperate need for control. Control over his emotions, control over his environment, and control over his destiny. But control is an illusion, and Batman's refusal to kill is just one way that he attempts to impose order on a world that is inherently chaotic. His moral code is a coping mechanism, a way to impose structure on a universe that refuses to be structured. In a sense, Batman's refusal to kill is not a sign of moral superiority. It is a manifestation of his fear of losing control, a fear that is tied directly to his trauma and his inability to forgive himself for the past. This fear of losing control is most evident in Batman's relationship with his greatest villains. Each of Batman's foes represents a different aspect of the chaos that he fights against, but they also represent the aspects of his own psyche that he refuses to confront. The Joker represents chaos, but also the part of Batman that yearns to break free from the constraints of his moral code. The Penguin, Two-Face, and the Riddler all represent different facets of Gotham's criminal underworld, but they also represent Batman's fear of what he could become if he were to allow himself to fully embrace his darker impulses. His moral code is not just a rejection of these criminals, it is a rejection of his own darkness. As we continue to explore Batman's psychological complexity, it becomes clear that his moral code is more than just a set of rules. It is a reflection of his internal struggles. His refusal to kill is not an act of moral clarity, it is an act of psychological survival. Batman's entire identity is built on the foundation of his trauma, and his moral code is the only thing that prevents him from unraveling completely. It is a mask that conceals the psychological wounds that he has never fully healed, a mask that he wears to protect himself from the unbearable weight of his past. The deeper we venture into Batman's psyche, the more we realize that his moral code serves as a fragile facade, one that masks profound internal conflict and unresolved trauma. His refusal to kill, while seemingly the hallmark of his heroism, might be less a conscious choice for justice than a manifestation of deep psychological issues that he has yet to address. At its core, Batman's moral code represents a desperate attempt to maintain order in a life dominated by chaos. His relentless war on crime is more than just a pursuit of justice. It is a way to control the uncontrollable, to suppress the darker, more chaotic aspects of his own identity. Yet, despite this control, Batman is continuously haunted by the ghosts of his past, unable to escape the emotional scars left by the brutal murder of his parents. Bruce Wayne's decision to fight crime in Gotham is, in many ways, an attempt to rewrite his tragic history, to rewrite the helplessness he felt that night in the alley. He could not save his parents, but he could save others, perhaps as a way of making amends for his perceived failure. This drive to protect Gotham, however, goes far beyond a desire for redemption. It is a form of escapism, a way for Bruce Wayne to lose himself in the mission, to prevent himself from confronting the feelings of guilt, fear, and loneliness that continuously plague him. His moral code is not just a reflection of his desire for justice. It is a mechanism to stave off the overwhelming emotions that would arise if he were to confront the reality of his trauma. At times, the mission itself seems to be more important to Batman than his own well-being. His single-minded focus on defeating crime and upholding justice often leads him to neglect his own needs and desires. He alienates himself from his friends, his allies, and even from the woman he loves, Rachel Dawes, because he cannot afford to let anything or anyone distract him from his mission. In this way, Batman's moral code becomes a source of further psychological isolation. His refusal to kill is not just a moral stance. It is a way of insulating himself from the vulnerability that comes with human connection. By maintaining his distance, he avoids the need to confront the emotional wounds that remain unhealed within him. The case of his relationship with his allies further exemplifies this isolation. Batman pushes away Robin, the one person who represents the possibility of emotional connection, because Robin's willingness to kill represents a direct threat to Batman's fragile control. Robin, in his youth and idealism, sees the world in black and white, and while Batman initially attempts to guide him, their differing moral compasses drive a wedge between them. Batman's inability to accept that others might be willing to take actions he deems unacceptable further deepens his isolation. His refusal to accept help, to share the emotional burden of his mission, reflects his belief that he is the only one who can bear the weight of Gotham's safety. This belief, while heroic, ultimately isolates him further, driving him into a perpetual state of emotional repression. Bruce Wayne's emotional repression, however, is not simply a matter of personal preference. It is a direct result of his inability to face his past. Throughout his years as Batman, he has systematically buried the trauma of his childhood, refusing to allow himself the opportunity to process the pain. This emotional suppression is made all the more complicated by his need to remain in control. Every time he confronts a criminal, every time he saves Gotham from the brink of destruction, Batman reaffirms the illusion of control he so desperately craves. But beneath the surface, the unresolved trauma festers, eating away at him, and the mask of the Dark Knight becomes a prison, trapping him in a cycle of guilt and self-denial. The Joker, as Batman's arch-nemesis, represents the ultimate challenge to his moral code, and by extension, his psychological stability. The Joker is everything that Batman fears he could become, a chaotic force who embraces violence, disorder, and anarchy without any moral restraint. Yet, despite their stark differences, the Joker and Batman share a deeper psychological connection. The Joker, much like Batman, is a man defined by his trauma, a man who has embraced his pain and used it to fuel his destructive nature. In many ways, the Joker serves as a distorted mirror of Batman, someone who has gone down a path that Batman constantly fears he might one day take. The Joker's consistent attempts to force Batman to break his rule are more than mere acts of villainy. They are attempts to break through the psychological walls that Batman has built around himself. The Joker knows that Batman's refusal to kill is not just a moral choice. It is a psychological condition, one rooted in fear. The Joker's provocations are designed to break Batman's hold on his moral code, to force him to confront the underlying psychological issues that make him incapable of killing. Batman's refusal to kill is not just a measure of his integrity, it is a defense mechanism. It is a way of holding on to the illusion of control, even when the world around him is spinning out of control. In this sense, Batman's relationship with the Joker represents the internal battle that rages within him. The Joker seeks to push Batman toward the brink, to strip away the mask and reveal the man behind the myth. But Batman's greatest enemy is not the Joker. It is the darkness within himself. The Joker's actions are merely the catalyst that forces Batman to confront the truth about his own psyche, that his moral code is not the product of idealism, but of fear, trauma, and psychological repression. This internal struggle between Batman's moral code and the chaos represented by the Joker underscores the deeper psychological themes at play in Batman's story. Batman's refusal to kill is not just a reflection of his dedication to justice, it is a manifestation of his fear of losing control over his own mind. The moral code that defines Batman's identity is in many ways a construct, one that shields him from the psychological chaos lurking just beneath the surface. Without this code, Batman fears he would lose the very thing that keeps him sane: control. Ultimately, Batman's psychological struggle is a tragic one. He is a man who has created a persona, the Dark Knight, to survive in a world that has taken everything from him. His moral code is not a sign of moral purity. It is a mask that conceals the brokenness within. It is a defense mechanism, a coping strategy that allows him to continue fighting in a world that offers no easy answers. But beneath the surface, Batman is a man constantly on the edge of losing himself. His fear of becoming like the very criminals he fights is not just a moral concern, it is a psychological one. If he were to break his own rule, he fears that he would lose not only his identity as Batman, but also his humanity. His refusal to kill is ultimately a desperate attempt to hold on to the only thing that gives his life meaning: control. As Batman's journey through Gotham's streets continues, the internal battle rages on. His moral code, though seemingly a reflection of his noble intentions, is in reality a fragile structure, one that crumbles whenever Batman is forced to confront the deeper, darker aspects of his psyche. Batman's moral code is his armor against the world, against his enemies, and most tragically against himself. But armor, no matter how strong, can only protect so much. Over time, cracks begin to form, and the mask Batman wears to shield himself from his trauma begins to fracture. The psychological toll of Batman's mission cannot be overstated. He spends his nights stalking Gotham's underworld, facing down criminals, corrupt politicians, and even his own demons. But each victory brings little relief. The deeper Batman dives into his role as Gotham's protector, the more the darkness within him threatens to overwhelm him. His refusal to kill, while steadfast, is not an act of pure moral righteousness. It is an attempt to stave off the overwhelming sense of powerlessness he felt as a child. Batman's need to save Gotham is deeply tied to his inability to save his parents. But no matter how many criminals he apprehends, no matter how many lives he saves, the grief over their death continues to gnaw at him. Each time he saves someone, he reaffirms his role as Gotham's protector, but he is unable to protect himself from the deep well of pain that lies within him. This cycle of self-sacrifice and isolation leads to an increasing sense of psychological fragmentation. Batman is torn between two identities: the billionaire playboy Bruce Wayne and the vigilante Batman. The public persona of Bruce Wayne is a facade, one that allows him to interact with the world, to play his role in society, and to keep his true identity hidden. But the reality is that Bruce Wayne no longer exists as an individual. He is merely a mask that Batman wears when he is not in costume. The true man behind the mask is Batman, a man defined by his mission, his trauma, and his need for control. The duality of Batman's identity becomes more pronounced as his relationships with those around him deteriorate. His unwillingness to allow anyone into his life, his refusal to form meaningful bonds, is a direct result of his psychological condition. Batman isolates himself from his allies because he fears that they will either become a burden or, worse, be used against him. This fear of vulnerability stems from his unresolved grief over the death of his parents. The trauma he experienced that night has led him to build emotional walls so high that no one, no matter how close, can breach them. Even Alfred, his trusted confidant, is kept at arm's length. While Alfred is the closest person to Bruce Wayne, their relationship is defined more by duty and loyalty than by genuine emotional connection. This isolation, though, has its consequences. Batman's self-imposed solitude heightens his sense of fear and guilt. He is never able to confront his pain as he buries it deeper each time he dons the cowl. Instead of dealing with his trauma, Batman channels it into his crime-fighting mission, never allowing himself the opportunity to heal. This perpetual state of emotional repression serves to magnify his psychological issues, feeding into his obsession with control. The more Batman isolates himself, and the more he adheres to his rigid moral code, the more his internal conflict intensifies. One of the most disturbing aspects of Batman's psychological makeup is his need for suffering. Batman's life is one of pain, sacrifice, and emotional numbness. He has chosen a path of relentless physical and emotional hardship, all in the name of justice. But the more he embraces this suffering, the more it becomes an integral part of his identity. It is almost as though Batman feels that he is only worthy of existence if he is constantly in pain. This need for suffering is not just a sign of emotional damage, it is a way for Batman to assert control over his past. By choosing to live a life of constant hardship, he convinces himself that he is in control of his destiny. The pain he endures is self-inflicted, a way for him to punish himself for his inability to save his parents and to atone for what he perceives as his own failings. At the same time, Batman's need for suffering feeds into his sense of isolation. His suffering becomes a badge of honor, a sign of his unwavering dedication to Gotham, but it is also a defense mechanism. By embracing pain, Batman shields himself from the vulnerability of emotional connection. If he were to open up to others, if he were to allow anyone to share in his pain, he would risk exposing his weaknesses, something he is unwilling to do. Instead, he continues to carry the burden alone, all the while masking his emotional wounds with the mask of the Dark Knight. The moral code that Batman upholds is a reflection of this complex relationship with suffering. His refusal to kill is not just about a commitment to justice, it is about the need to avoid becoming like the criminals he fights. If he were to kill, it would represent the ultimate surrender to the chaos and pain he fears. But the irony is that Batman's refusal to kill is also a form of self-punishment. By upholding his code, he denies himself the opportunity for emotional release. He refuses to allow himself the catharsis that might come with taking a life, even if it would bring him some sense of closure. The refusal to kill becomes a form of emotional stasis, a way for Batman to remain locked in a cycle of guilt and repression. Furthermore, Batman's need for control is not only evident in his moral code, but also in his obsession with his physical and mental limitations. Batman constantly pushes himself to the brink, testing the limits of his endurance, strength, and intelligence. His training is designed not just to prepare him for combat, but to help him gain mastery over every aspect of his life. This need for control extends to his body, his mind, and his environment. Batman's control over his environment is evident in the meticulously planned operations he conducts as Gotham's protector. Every move is calculated, every contingency planned for, as though the very act of controlling his surroundings will keep the chaos at bay. But despite all this effort, Batman cannot escape the fact that he is ultimately powerless to change his past. No matter how many criminals he defeats, no matter how much justice he dispenses, the trauma of losing his parents remains. This inability to change his past leaves Batman in a constant state of psychological tension. He is forever chasing after something that is out of reach, a sense of closure, a sense of peace that he will never find as long as he remains trapped in his own psychological labyrinth. In the end, Batman's refusal to kill and his obsessive adherence to his moral code are not just noble acts, they are manifestations of a man who has lost touch with his own humanity. His moral code is a defense mechanism, a way for him to avoid confronting the pain and chaos that exist within him. But this defense, while protecting him from the outside world, only deepens his internal conflict. The moral code that Batman upholds is, in many ways, a prison, a psychological cage that keeps him locked in a perpetual cycle of guilt, fear, and isolation. His refusal to kill is not an act of justice, but an act of survival. It is his way of holding on to the last shred of control in a life that is ultimately beyond his grasp. As we dive even deeper into Batman's psyche, the central theme of control becomes all the more pronounced. Batman's moral code is, at its core, a mechanism for control. Control over his emotions, control over his actions, and most importantly, control over his destiny. The trauma that he suffered as a child, the brutal, senseless murder of his parents, has left him with a profound need for control, a need to ensure that nothing in his life, or in the world around him, spirals out of his grasp. But the paradox here is that no matter how much Batman strives for control, he cannot change the past. His parents are dead. Gotham is still a city gripped by crime, and no matter how many criminals he defeats, the underlying disorder remains unchanged. This inability to resolve his past, to heal his deep psychological wounds, leaves Batman in a constant state of internal conflict. This psychological struggle manifests most acutely in Batman's interactions with the people closest to him. While he pushes away Robin, his most trusted ally, he also demonstrates his inability to let go of his need to control everything around him, even at the cost of relationships. His obsession with control not only isolates him but also undermines his ability to trust others. Batman's relationships with figures like Alfred and Rachel are often strained by his emotional distance. Despite Alfred's role as a father figure and confidant, Batman remains emotionally closed off, unable to let anyone fully into his world. The very idea of allowing someone into his emotional life challenges the fragile control he has so carefully constructed over the years. Batman's refusal to embrace vulnerability, however, becomes a double-edged sword. On the one hand, his emotional detachment allows him to function in the chaotic, unpredictable world of Gotham's crime-ridden streets. He is able to make decisions without being swayed by emotions, remaining cold, calculating, and effective in his mission. On the other hand, this detachment comes at the cost of his own humanity. The longer Batman clings to his moral code, the more detached he becomes from the very essence of who he was before the trauma. He loses touch with his humanity, subsuming his own desires and emotions to the greater cause of justice. This detachment, while necessary for his survival, ultimately leads to his emotional numbness and psychological deterioration. The emotional numbness that Batman experiences becomes apparent in his relationship with Rachel Dawes, the woman he loves. Batman's refusal to open up to Rachel, his constant push for her to understand why he cannot be with her, is a reflection of his fear of vulnerability. Rachel represents the possibility of emotional healing, the possibility of love and human connection, but Batman is too afraid to accept that possibility. His obsession with his mission, his refusal to kill, and his moral code are all strategies to shield himself from the emotional pain that he fears would be unleashed if he were to allow himself to feel deeply. In this sense, Rachel becomes a symbol of everything Batman cannot have: true emotional intimacy and the freedom to live a life outside of the shadow of his trauma. Batman's relationships with his villains also reflect his psychological issues. The Joker, in particular, serves as a mirror to Batman's deepest fears and insecurities. The Joker's chaotic nature and complete disregard for moral codes force Batman to confront his own beliefs about justice, control, and the nature of evil. The Joker constantly pushes Batman to break his moral code, to surrender to the chaos that the Joker represents. The Joker's ability to manipulate Batman is not merely a matter of creating havoc, it is about drawing out Batman's inner fears and doubts, forcing him to confront the fragility of his own psychological defenses. For Batman, the Joker represents a terrifying possibility, the possibility that beneath the mask of the Dark Knight, he is not a hero at all, but merely another reflection of the darkness and chaos that surrounds him. The Joker's role in Batman's life is symbolic of the internal conflict Batman faces on a daily basis. While Batman struggles to maintain his moral code, the Joker embodies the exact opposite, a character who has embraced chaos and nihilism. Where Batman's world is defined by order, structure, and the pursuit of justice, the Joker's world is one of destruction, madness, and anarchy. This clash between Batman's need for control and the Joker's embodiment of chaos is what makes their relationship so complex. In many ways, the Joker is not just Batman's enemy, he is Batman's mirror image, a distorted reflection of everything Batman fears he might become. This fear is particularly evident in the Joker's ability to manipulate Batman's sense of guilt. The Joker understands that Batman's refusal to kill is tied to his guilt over the death of his parents. By using that guilt against Batman, the Joker is able to exploit Batman's deepest vulnerability. The Joker's manipulation of Batman is a reflection of how trauma, guilt, and psychological instability can be weaponized. For Batman, the moral code he holds so dear becomes a tool of self-punishment. His refusal to kill is not just a moral stance, it is a psychological defense against the overwhelming guilt and trauma that haunt him. But the Joker's attempts to break Batman's rule reveal how fragile that defense truly is. The deeper the Joker pushes Batman to confront his own guilt and fear, the closer Batman comes to breaking under the weight of his own psychological burdens. It is important to recognize that Batman's moral code, while appearing to be a manifestation of justice, is ultimately a psychological coping mechanism. His refusal to kill is not just a rejection of murder, it is a way for Batman to distance himself from the chaos and trauma that defines his existence. By adhering to his moral code, Batman maintains a sense of order, a sense that he is in control of his destiny, but this control is an illusion, a thin veneer that masks the deep psychological instability that Batman struggles to manage. As the Joker continually presses Batman to confront his darkest fears, the true fragility of Batman's moral code is revealed. The longer Batman maintains his rigid adherence to his code, the more he isolates himself, the more he distances himself from any possibility of healing. Batman's journey is one of constant struggle, not just against Gotham's criminals, but against the chaos within himself. His refusal to kill, while noble on the surface, is ultimately a defense against the darkness that threatens to consume him. His moral code is not a pure reflection of justice, but a psychological survival mechanism. It is the one thing that keeps him from spiraling into madness, the one thing that separates him from the very criminals he fights against. But this survival comes at a great cost. His emotional isolation, his inability to connect with others, and his constant battle against the guilt and trauma that define his existence. In the end, Batman is a tragic figure. Not just because of his loss, but because he is unable to heal from it. His moral code is not a source of strength, it is a barrier to healing, a shield that keeps him locked in a perpetual state of emotional and psychological unrest. His refusal to kill is not the act of a hero, it is the act of a man too afraid to confront the darkness within. It is a mask, a way to survive in a world that has stripped him of his innocence and forced him to live a life of endless pain. And yet, despite all of this, Batman continues to fight, driven by the hope that one day, somehow, he will make Gotham and himself whole again. But whether that day will ever come is another matter entirely. As we push further into Batman's psyche, one cannot ignore the profound toll that his unwavering commitment to his moral code takes on him. While it may seem that his refusal to kill is a mark of honor and integrity, in reality, it serves as a constant source of internal struggle. Batman's code is a psychological paradox. It is simultaneously the thing that defines him and the thing that holds him captive in a never-ending cycle of self-denial and repression. His refusal to kill, born from his early trauma, has grown into something much more insidious, a psychological crutch that he can no longer live without. This moral code, essentially Batman's version of an unbreakable law, may be the very thing that keeps him from accepting the full scope of his humanity. His need to protect Gotham and punish its criminals is not solely about justice. It is about something deeper, something rooted in his past. The death of his parents left him with a profound sense of helplessness, a fear that he could never fully protect the people he loves. This fear of vulnerability, of being powerless in the face of overwhelming evil, has led him to adopt an almost obsessive commitment to control. His moral code is his way of asserting that, despite everything, he is still in charge, still able to keep the darkness at bay. But in doing so, Batman is forced to constantly distance himself from the very things that make him human, his emotions, his relationships, and the possibility of healing. The tragedy of Batman's moral code lies in its inherent contradiction. While it is meant to protect him from becoming like the criminals he fights, it also serves as a mechanism of self-punishment. Batman does not allow himself the closure that comes from killing. In his refusal to take a life, he binds himself to an emotional and psychological prison, one where his trauma remains ever present. Each time Batman faces the temptation to kill, whether it's to end a fight with a criminal or to stop a villain from causing more destruction, he must reaffirm his commitment to a rule that is as much about denying his pain as it is about upholding justice. The more Batman upholds his moral code, the more he ties himself to his unresolved past, reinforcing the belief that he must atone for his parents' deaths by never stooping to the level of the criminals he fights. Batman's moral code is a manifestation of his deep fear, the fear that he will never be able to heal from the trauma that haunts him. His refusal to kill is a way of maintaining control over his identity, of keeping the image of the Dark Knight intact. But in doing so, Batman traps himself in a cycle of pain and repression, one that prevents him from finding peace or true resolution. His code is an elaborate psychological defense, a way to keep the floodgates of emotion closed, even when the pressure to break free is overwhelming. But this denial of self is not sustainable forever. The more Batman resists his emotional needs, and the more he strives to remain emotionally distant, the more fractured his sense of self becomes. The irony of Batman's moral code is that, despite all his efforts to protect Gotham, it is Gotham itself that reflects the fractured nature of his identity. Gotham is a city defined by chaos, crime, and violence, a microcosm of the very darkness that Batman fights against. And yet, for all of his efforts to impose order on this chaotic city, Batman is unable to impose order on his own mind. The city, in many ways, mirrors Batman's internal state, a battleground between justice and chaos, between control and surrender. Gotham is a city that Batman is both deeply connected to and forever disconnected from, just as Batman is both a hero and a man haunted by his past. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Batman's moral code is the way it isolates him from the very people he is trying to protect. His refusal to kill sets him apart from the likes of Superman, who often sees his moral code as flexible, or even from the more pragmatic heroes in the Justice League. Superman, for instance, has been known to bend his rules when necessary, something that Batman cannot and will not do. This difference highlights the depth of Batman's emotional scars. His moral code is not merely a reflection of his desire to be virtuous, it is an expression of his psychological need to control everything around him. It is a way of making sense of a world that has often seemed senseless and cruel, especially when viewed through the lens of the child who watched his parents die in a dark alley. But the tragedy of Batman is that his need for control comes at the cost of his relationships. His inability to form deep emotional connections with those around him, whether it's Robin, Rachel, or even Alfred, serves to reinforce his psychological isolation. He pushes them away not because he does not care about them, but because he believes that in doing so, he can protect them from the dangers of his mission. At the same time, however, this isolation reinforces Batman's loneliness and deepens his sense of self-loathing. He convinces himself that he is better off alone, that the burden of Gotham's salvation is too great for anyone else to bear. But in doing so, he loses the very thing that might have helped him heal connection with others. Batman's moral code, ultimately, is a manifestation of his fear of becoming like the criminals he fights. But it is also a manifestation of his fear of intimacy, of allowing others into his emotional world. He is terrified that if he were to let someone else into his life, they would see the real Bruce Wayne, the vulnerable, broken man who has never healed from the loss of his parents. This fear, in turn, feeds into his sense of isolation. The more Batman distances himself from others, the more he deepens the psychological scars that prevent him from living a full life. His moral code, rather than serving as a source of strength, becomes a prison, one that keeps him locked in a perpetual cycle of guilt and repression. It is this isolation, this emotional numbness, that makes Batman one of the most tragic figures in comic book history. He is a man who has sacrificed everything: his relationships, his happiness, and his emotional well-being in the pursuit of justice. But the cost of this sacrifice has been high. In his quest to protect Gotham, Batman has lost the very thing that makes life worth living: human connection. His moral code, rather than being a symbol of his strength, has become a symbol of his inner torment. The more he adheres to this code, the more he isolates himself from the people who could help him heal. In the end, Batman's refusal to kill is not a sign of moral purity. It is a sign of psychological fragility. It is a symptom of a man who cannot forgive himself for the trauma of his past, and who, in his fear of losing control, has built a life defined by isolation, guilt, and emotional repression. His moral code, rather than being a shield against evil, becomes a mask that conceals the deeper psychological issues that he has never confronted. And perhaps the most tragic aspect of this is that despite all his strength, all his bravery, and all his heroism, Batman may never truly find peace. For as long as he wears the mask of the Dark Knight, he will remain locked in a cycle of self-denial, unable to confront the very darkness that lies within him. As we delve deeper into Batman's psyche, one central theme becomes clear. His refusal to kill is not merely an abstract moral stance, but a manifestation of his fear and his unresolved trauma. Batman's sense of justice, though profound and deeply ingrained in his character, is intricately tied to a fear of becoming something worse than the criminals he fights. This fear is born out of his childhood trauma, the night his parents were murdered. Batman cannot allow himself to kill because, on a subconscious level, he believes that in doing so, he would relinquish his humanity. His moral code therefore becomes a psychological bulwark against his fear of slipping into the very chaos that destroyed his life. The refusal to kill serves as a constant reminder for Batman of the deep emotional wounds that drive him. While he may outwardly present himself as the Dark Knight, dedicated to protecting Gotham at all costs, the truth is that Batman is constantly fighting a losing battle against his own emotional fragility. His moral code offers a way to maintain control over the darkness inside him, yet it also keeps him trapped in a state of emotional repression, unable to confront his deepest fears and needs. The very code that he holds so dear becomes a double-edged sword. It serves as both his salvation and his undoing. The emotional toll of this inner conflict becomes evident in the manner in which Batman interacts with others, particularly with those closest to him. Bruce Wayne's dual identity, Batman and the public figure of the billionaire playboy, only serves to heighten the psychological strain he experiences. His detachment from the world around him, including his inability to form meaningful relationships, is a direct result of his fear of losing control. Batman's moral code, while it makes him an effective crime fighter, simultaneously alienates him from the people who could help him heal. His refusal to kill is not simply a testament to his sense of justice, but a psychological barrier that isolates him from the emotional connections that might provide him with the support he so desperately needs. The tragic irony of Batman's situation is that, despite his capacity to inspire and protect others, he is unable to protect himself from the darkness that has consumed him. His moral code becomes a tool of emotional self-flagellation, a way to punish himself for the death of his parents. While Batman's mission to rid Gotham of crime and corruption is commendable, it is also a form of self-destructive behavior. He refuses to heal, refusing to face the pain of his past, and instead continues to dive deeper into the work that keeps him distracted, but never truly fulfilled. In this sense, his moral code is not a symbol of his strength, but rather a reflection of his inability to confront his vulnerability. The relationships Batman has with his allies, such as Robin and Alfred, are similarly strained due to his emotional detachment. Robin, who symbolizes youthful optimism and a desire for companionship, is often pushed away by Batman's emotional walls. While Batman tries to mentor Robin, their differing views on morality, especially when it comes to the idea of killing, create a rift between them. Batman's inability to accept the fact that Robin might need to make different moral choices is emblematic of his own struggle with control. His constant need to maintain his moral purity keeps him from recognizing that the world is not so black and white. In pushing Robin away, Batman further isolates himself, denying the possibility of true companionship. Alfred, perhaps the closest person to Batman, also struggles to reach the emotionally closed-off vigilante. Despite his deep care for Bruce Wayne, Alfred is constantly reminded of the emotional wall that Batman has built around himself. Even though Alfred is a surrogate father figure to Bruce, the emotional distance between them remains ever present. Batman's inability to truly open up to Alfred, or to rely on him emotionally, speaks to the deep psychological issues that prevent Batman from forming genuine human connections. The relationship between Batman and Alfred becomes not only a reflection of Batman's internal struggles, but also a manifestation of his need for control and self-reliance. The tragic nature of Batman's moral code is highlighted in his relationship with Rachel Dawes. Rachel represents the possibility of a life outside of Gotham's darkness, a life filled with love, hope, and normalcy. However, Batman's refusal to allow himself the possibility of happiness with Rachel is an indication of just how deeply his trauma has affected him. In his mind, To allow Rachel into his life would be to let down his guard, to allow vulnerability and imperfection into a life that has been defined by control and emotional repression. He believes that he must remain detached in order to protect the people he loves, but in doing so, he denies himself the very thing that could help him heal human connection. Rachel's presence in Batman's life is a reminder of what could have been, a life in which he could move past his trauma and find peace. But Batman is unable to let go of the past, unable to forgive himself for the death of his parents, and thus unable to allow himself the possibility of true happiness. His refusal to kill is not just about morality, it is about his inability to reconcile with the pain of his past. By adhering to his strict code, Batman isolates himself from those who would offer him the healing he so desperately needs. The idea that Batman's refusal to kill is rooted in his fear of losing control is further emphasized by his relationship with the Joker. The Joker represents the antithesis of everything Batman fears becoming. Whereas Batman's moral code is a strict adherence to order, the Joker embraces chaos and anarchy. The Joker is a reflection of the darkness that Batman desperately tries to suppress. The Joker constantly taunts Batman, pushing him to the edge, attempting to break his moral code. But what the Joker truly seeks is not just Batman's destruction, it is the destruction of Batman's sense of self. By forcing Batman to confront the idea of killing, the Joker aims to break down the barriers Batman has built to protect himself from his trauma. The Joker understands Batman's greatest fear, that if he were to kill, he would cease to be the hero he believes himself to be. Killing would be an admission that Batman has failed, that he has lost control of the moral code that has sustained him for so long. It is the very thing Batman dreads, the idea that his identity, his sense of purpose, is fragile, and that he could easily slip into the same moral darkness that defines the criminals he fights. The Joker's attempts to manipulate Batman's code are a psychological game designed to make Batman question his very existence. Ultimately, Batman's refusal to kill is not an expression of moral superiority, but a psychological defense mechanism. It is an attempt to keep the darkness at bay, to maintain control over a fractured sense of self. By adhering to his moral code, Batman tries to hold on to the image of the Dark Knight, the image of a man who fights for justice, no matter the cost. But in doing so, he continues to deny himself the opportunity to heal. His code, which was once a symbol of his strength, becomes a chain that binds him to his past, to his unresolved trauma, and to a life of emotional isolation. Batman's journey, then, is not just about saving Gotham, it is about saving himself. His refusal to kill is not an act of heroism, but an act of survival. He is constantly fighting to keep his identity intact, to avoid falling into the chaos that threatens to consume him. But in doing so, he never allows himself the opportunity to truly heal. His code becomes a prison, one that he cannot escape, no matter how many criminals he defeats or how many lives he saves. As Batman's internal struggles intensify, the more the mask of the Dark Knight becomes a suffocating shroud, weighing heavily on his psyche. The world around him continues to demand justice, but the deeper he immerses himself in his mission, the more he begins to lose sight of who he truly is beneath the mask. Batman's refusal to kill, which initially seemed like a self-imposed moral rule, becomes a haunting reminder of the trauma he refuses to confront. His rigid adherence to this code not only isolates him, but also traps him in an endless cycle of self-doubt, guilt, and emotional numbness. At its core, Batman's mission is one of atonement. Every night he spends in Gotham's streets is an attempt to atone for the one thing he could not control, his parents' death. His obsessive need to fight crime and bring justice to the city is his way of reasserting control over the uncontrollable. However, this desperate need for control reveals a much deeper psychological flaw, the fear of vulnerability. Batman's refusal to allow himself to be vulnerable, to trust others, is an unconscious defense mechanism. He pushes away those who care about him, believing that to let them in would be to expose himself to the same pain that destroyed his childhood. This fear of vulnerability is intricately tied to Batman's moral code. His refusal to kill is not merely a way of drawing a line between himself and the criminals he fights. It is also a mechanism to keep his emotions and inner turmoil in check. If Batman were to kill, he would not only cross a moral boundary, but would also confront the rawness of his own pain. Killing would force him to face the deeper psychological issues he has buried for so long, the unresolved grief over his parents, the guilt over his perceived failure to protect them, and the fear that he is no better than the criminals he fights. These psychological wounds, if exposed, would destabilize the fragile identity he has constructed as the Dark Knight. But in his attempt to shield himself from this emotional chaos, Batman inadvertently creates a cycle of emotional repression that only deepens his psychological anguish. His refusal to kill, which he believes will prevent him from becoming like the very criminals he hunts, instead locks him in a perpetual state of guilt and fear. The more he clings to his moral code, the more he isolates himself from the possibility of healing. His inability to forgive himself, to move beyond the pain of his past, becomes the true source of his torment. Batman's greatest enemy, ultimately, is not the Joker or the criminals of Gotham, but the darkness within himself. The fear that, if he were to let go of his code, he would lose everything he has worked so hard to build. The tragedy of Batman's situation lies in the paradox of his moral code. His refusal to kill is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. It defines him as a hero, but it also traps him in a cycle of self-destructive behavior. By adhering to his code, Batman maintains the illusion of control, the belief that he can prevent himself from slipping into the same moral darkness as the criminals he fights. But in doing so, he denies himself the opportunity to confront the very fears that define him. His code becomes a mask, a shield against the vulnerability he fears will consume him, and yet, the more he clings to it, the more he isolates himself from the possibility of healing, from the chance to form meaningful connections, and from the peace he so desperately seeks. Batman's relationship with the Joker is a particularly poignant illustration of the psychological conflict that Batman faces. The Joker, as Batman's greatest adversary, represents the embodiment of chaos, nihilism, and the rejection of moral boundaries. The Joker's unpredictability and willingness to kill without remorse stands in direct contrast to Batman's rigid moral code. Yet, despite their differences, Batman and the Joker are psychologically linked in a way that neither fully understands. The Joker is a reflection of the darkness Batman fears within himself, a reminder of the possibility that he, too, could be consumed by the same chaotic impulses. The Joker knows that Batman's refusal to kill is not just a moral choice, it is a psychological necessity. By pushing Batman to break his moral code, the Joker is not simply trying to create chaos, he is trying to break the fragile psychological construct that Batman has built around himself. The Joker's role in Batman's life is not just that of a villain, it is that of a mirror, reflecting back to Batman the very fears and doubts that Batman works so hard to suppress. By constantly challenging Batman's moral code, The Joker forces Batman to confront the possibility that his identity is fragile, that the very thing that makes him Batman, the refusal to kill, might be a symptom of his deep-seated psychological issues. For Batman, the Joker represents the ultimate challenge, not just a villain to be defeated, but the embodiment of the chaos that threatens to destroy the carefully constructed facade that Batman relies on to maintain control. But the Joker's true power lies in his ability to manipulate Batman's fear of losing control. Every time Batman is forced to confront the Joker's provocations, he is faced with the possibility that his moral code is not the result of a noble desire for justice, but a psychological defense against his own inner darkness. The Joker is not trying to defeat Batman in the conventional sense. He is trying to force Batman to confront the very thing that Batman fears most, that his moral code is not a reflection of his heroic nature, but a mask to protect him from the vulnerability and chaos that he believes would destroy him. The Joker's manipulation exposes the fragility of Batman's identity and challenges the very foundation of the moral code that Batman has built his life around. At the heart of Batman's psychological struggle is a fear of losing himself, a fear that by allowing himself to feel, to connect with others, he will lose his sense of purpose. The more Batman holds onto his code, the more he isolates himself from the people who could help him heal. His refusal to kill is in many ways a refusal to acknowledge the humanity in others, but also a refusal to acknowledge his own humanity. It is as if, by maintaining his moral code, Batman can avoid confronting the very thing that makes him human, the capacity for pain, vulnerability, and connection. Ultimately, Batman's greatest struggle is not against the criminals of Gotham, but against the psychological scars of his past. His refusal to kill is a coping mechanism, a way to distance himself from the fear, guilt, and trauma that have defined his life. But in doing so, Batman creates a psychological prison for himself, one that traps him in a cycle of emotional repression. His moral code, rather than being a source of strength, becomes a barrier that prevents him from healing, from finding peace, and from truly living. The tragedy of Batman's story is that, despite his heroic actions and his tireless pursuit of justice, he remains a broken man, unable to forgive himself for the trauma of his past. His refusal to kill is not an act of heroism. It is an act of survival, a way to hold on to the illusion of control in a world that has stripped him of his innocence. But the longer Batman clings to his moral code, the more he denies himself the possibility of healing, of reconciliation, and of redemption. As we continue to examine the tragedy of Batman's psychological condition, it becomes clear that his refusal to kill is not simply a manifestation of his personal moral code, but rather a reflection of his deeper psychological need to remain in control. The psychological burden that Batman carries, stemming from his unresolved trauma, is immense. It is clear that his mission as Gotham's protector is not just a path to justice, but a way to cope with the overwhelming pain and guilt he feels from the loss of his parents. His moral code, though it appears as a form of ethical purity, is deeply tied to the psychological trauma that has shaped his identity. The truth of Batman's struggle is that his refusal to kill is not just about protecting Gotham. It is about protecting himself from the uncontrollable emotions that threaten to consume him. Every action he takes, every decision he makes, is driven by a desperate need to avoid the deeper emotional turmoil that he believes would occur if he were to abandon his moral code. This is what makes his moral code so tragically complex. It is not a simple reflection of his commitment to justice. It is a psychological mechanism designed to maintain emotional stability. The problem, however, is that this stability is an illusion. Batman's refusal to kill keeps him in a state of emotional isolation, a constant battle between his need for control and the deep well of grief and fear that he has buried inside himself. This fear of vulnerability is perhaps best illustrated by Batman's interactions with those closest to him. His relationship with Robin, for example, exemplifies the rift between Batman's desire for control and his inability to trust others. Robin represents the very thing that Batman fears: someone who is willing to accept the complexity of moral decisions and embrace the possibility of imperfection. For Batman, allowing Robin to take on the responsibility of making difficult choices, such as killing when necessary, would mean losing control, which Batman simply cannot afford. His need for moral purity leads him to push Robin away, reinforcing the isolation that defines Batman's life. By maintaining strict control over his actions and the moral code he lives by, Batman distances himself from the very humanity he is trying to protect. His inability to accept that others, like Robin, might take different moral paths only deepens his internal conflict. Batman is trapped in a psychological cycle, unable to reconcile his desire to protect Gotham with the emotional walls he has built around himself. His refusal to kill is not merely a matter of moral superiority, it is the result of his deep-seated fear of losing control, of confronting the vulnerability that lies at the heart of his being. Batman's emotional detachment is also evident in his relationship with Alfred, the only person who has consistently stood by him throughout his journey. Alfred, despite his love and concern for Bruce, is continually kept at arm's length. Even though Alfred is a father figure to Bruce, Batman's inability to let Alfred into his emotional world underscores the depth of Batman's psychological struggle. This emotional distance is not due to a lack of affection, but rather a manifestation of Batman's deep fear of being exposed. If he were to open up to Alfred, if he were to let down his guard, he would have to confront the very trauma that he has spent his entire life avoiding. This emotional avoidance is also seen in Batman's relationship with Rachel Dawes. Rachel represents the possibility of love, connection, and a life outside of Gotham's crime-ridden streets. Yet Batman's fear of allowing her into his world prevents him from fully embracing the life that could bring him happiness. Rachel's presence in Batman's life is a constant reminder of what could be, a symbol of hope and emotional healing. But by distancing himself from her, Batman refuses to allow himself the opportunity to experience true emotional intimacy. His need to protect Gotham, to uphold his moral code, prevents him from taking the emotional risks that would allow him to heal. The tragic irony of Batman's situation is that the one thing he needs most, human connection, remains just out of reach, locked behind the emotional walls he has built. The central theme of Batman's journey is the contradiction between his need for control and his refusal to confront his past. His moral code, initially a way to uphold justice, becomes a self-imposed prison that keeps him from moving forward. While he might appear as a symbol of unyielding justice, his refusal to kill represents a deeper, darker aspect of his psyche, a fear of vulnerability and emotional exposure. Batman is constantly caught between the need to protect Gotham and the need to protect himself from the very emotions that threaten to destabilize him. In this battle, he isolates himself from those who could offer him solace, creating a barrier between himself and the human connections he so desperately needs. The Joker, as Batman's greatest adversary, serves as both an external antagonist and a reflection of Batman's inner turmoil. The Joker is a force of chaos, an embodiment of the very disorder and unpredictability that Batman fears. While Batman's life is defined by control, order, and justice, the Joker's life is defined by the complete rejection of these principles. Their conflict is not just about crime and punishment. It is about the psychological war between Batman's need for control and the Joker's embodiment of freedom from all moral codes. The Joker understands Batman better than anyone else. He knows that Batman's refusal to kill is not simply about morality, it is about self-preservation. The Joker's constant attempts to push Batman to break his rule are designed to exploit Batman's greatest fear, that in killing, he would lose the very essence of his identity. The Joker's provocations force Batman to confront the truth about himself, that his moral code is not just a choice, but a crutch, a psychological defense mechanism that allows him to avoid confronting the pain of his past. The Joker's ultimate goal is to break Batman, to expose the cracks in his seemingly invulnerable moral framework, and force him to face the raw emotion he has spent his life suppressing. But while the Joker succeeds in challenging Batman's code, he does not fully succeed in breaking him. Batman's moral code remains intact, even if it is increasingly fragile. This persistence reflects Batman's ultimate tragedy. Despite all of his psychological burdens, despite his emotional isolation and repression, Batman continues to cling to his code. He remains trapped in a cycle of self-punishment, unable to break free from the chains of guilt and fear that have defined his life. His refusal to kill is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. It is the thing that defines him as a hero, but also the thing that keeps him locked in his own emotional prison. Batman's story is not just one of triumph and heroism. It is one of deep psychological struggle. His moral code, rather than being a symbol of his righteousness, is a psychological survival mechanism, a way to keep the darkness at bay. But this mechanism also keeps him from truly healing, from moving beyond his past, and from allowing himself the possibility of happiness. Batman's refusal to kill, his need for control, and his emotional isolation all point to a tragic truth, that the one thing he needs most, emotional connection and healing, is the one thing he refuses to embrace. In the end, Batman's moral code is a mask, one that hides the brokenness within. The Dark Knight, while an icon of justice and strength, is ultimately a tragic figure, forever haunted by the trauma of his past and the fear that if he were to break his own code, he would lose everything he has fought to protect. His refusal to kill is not an act of heroism, it is an act of survival, an attempt to preserve his sense of identity and control in a world that offers him no certainty. As we continue to explore the psychological intricacies of Batman's character, the consequences of his moral code become even more apparent. The core tragedy of Batman is that, despite his immense physical prowess, intellectual brilliance, and unyielding determination, he is ultimately imprisoned by his own psyche. His moral code, which he believes is what separates him from the criminals he hunts, is in fact the very thing that shackles him to his past, preventing him from healing and moving forward. The refusal to kill, though it may seem like an admirable commitment to justice, is in reality a symbol of Batman's inability to confront the darkness that lies within him. The guilt and trauma that Batman carries with him every day are not just abstract emotions, they shape his every decision, his every relationship, and his every action. Every time he takes down a criminal, every time he saves Gotham, he is not just fighting for justice, he is fighting for his own psychological survival. The mission he has undertaken is not just about saving Gotham from evil, but about saving himself from the overwhelming grief and fear that threaten to consume him. But despite his best efforts, the past remains with him, always lurking in the background, and the more Batman pushes it down, the more powerful and destructive it becomes. This battle between pushing down his emotions and the need to confront them is evident in Batman's interactions with his allies, especially Robin. Robin represents what Batman could have: companionship, a sense of emotional connection, and a sense of family. But Batman cannot afford to let that happen. His inability to embrace these emotional bonds is not because he does not care about those around him, but because he is terrified that allowing these relationships to flourish will expose him to the very vulnerability that he has spent his life avoiding. His moral code, therefore, serves as a barrier against emotional intimacy. It isolates him, preventing him from forming meaningful connections that could potentially lead to healing and closure. Alfred, the father figure who raised Bruce Wayne after his parents' death, is perhaps the only one who comes close to understanding the full weight of Batman's burdens. Yet even Alfred is constantly kept at a distance. Despite his attempts to offer comfort, guidance, and fatherly love, Batman remains emotionally closed off. The psychological damage Batman has sustained is so deep that even those who care for him cannot break through the emotional walls he has constructed. Alfred's role in Bruce's life is both essential and tragically inadequate. As much as he offers wisdom and counsel, he is unable to fully reach the emotionally shut-off man who wears the mask of the Dark Knight. Even Rachel Dawes, the one woman Batman truly loves, cannot break through his psychological defenses. Rachel represents the possibility of a normal life, a life where Batman is not consumed by the trauma of his past. Yet, Batman cannot allow himself to let her in. His refusal to kill is tied directly to his belief that he cannot afford to embrace his humanity. To allow Rachel into his life would mean opening himself to the possibility of losing control, of confronting the very darkness he fears. And so, he chooses to remain emotionally isolated, trapped in the cycle of guilt and fear that defines his existence. The emotional isolation that Batman experiences is compounded by his inability to fully trust anyone. His sense of control, so deeply tied to his moral code, prevents him from sharing the burden of his mission with others. While he may work with the police or even collaborate with other heroes in the Justice League, Batman's sense of self-reliance keeps him from forming deep, trusting relationships. This isolation, while providing a sense of security, only exacerbates Batman's emotional and psychological distress. The more he isolates himself, the more he becomes a prisoner of his own mind, unable to escape the constant emotional turmoil that haunts him. Batman's relationship with his greatest adversary, the Joker, highlights the psychological dichotomy that Batman faces on a daily basis. The Joker, representing chaos, madness, and the complete rejection of moral codes, is everything Batman fears becoming: the Joker's actions. And his constant attempts to push Batman to break his moral code serve as a psychological test for Batman. Every time the Joker challenges Batman's refusal to kill, he is pushing Batman to confront the underlying fear that defines his existence: the fear of losing control. The Joker's relentless pursuit of chaos forces Batman to question whether his moral code is a reflection of his true values, or whether it is merely a defense mechanism designed to keep him from confronting his own vulnerability. The Joker, in many ways, is Batman's mirror image. He represents the darkness that Batman fears exists within him. While Batman maintains a strict moral code to control the chaos within, the Joker revels in that very chaos. Their relationship is not just one of good versus evil, it is a battle between control and surrender, order and chaos, structure and disorder. The Joker knows that the key to breaking Batman lies not in defeating him physically, but in breaking his moral code, forcing Batman to confront the raw emotional truth that lies beneath the surface. The Joker understands that Batman's refusal to kill is not just about moral superiority. It is about psychological survival. The more the Joker taunts Batman, pushing him to abandon his moral code, the more Batman is forced to confront his fear of losing control, of letting the chaos that the Joker represents into his life. The Joker does not care about Gotham's safety or about Batman's mission. What the Joker cares about is revealing the fragility of Batman's identity, exposing the cracks in the moral code that Batman has used to shield himself from his past. The deeper Batman's struggle with the Joker becomes, the more apparent it is that the true battle is not just about saving Gotham, but about saving himself. Batman is not just fighting criminals. He is fighting against the very fear and guilt that haunt him. The more he battles the darkness within Gotham, the more he distances himself from the possibility of healing. His refusal to kill is a form of self-punishment, a way to hold on to the idea that he can remain the hero, that he can protect Gotham without succumbing to the chaos that destroyed his childhood. This cycle of self-punishment and emotional repression, while keeping Batman functional as Gotham's protector, ultimately prevents him from moving forward. He is stuck in the past, unable to heal from the trauma that has defined his life. His moral code, instead of being a tool of justice, becomes an emotional and psychological anchor, keeping him tied to the very pain he wishes to escape. Batman may be able to save Gotham time and time again, but he cannot save himself from the darkness that resides within. The more he holds on to his moral code, the more he sinks deeper into a psychological prison, one that he can never escape unless he is willing to confront the very fear and guilt that has defined his existence. Ultimately, Batman's refusal to kill is a reflection of his inability to forgive himself, to let go of the trauma that has shaped him. The mask of the Dark Knight, which has become his identity, is not just a symbol of heroism. It is a mask that conceals the brokenness within his moral code. While it may seem like a reflection of his unshakable resolve, it is a psychological barrier that prevents him from experiencing the emotional catharsis he so desperately needs. The tragedy of Batman's story is not that he is incapable of heroism, but that he is unable to heal from the wounds that define him. The more he clings to his moral code, the more he distances himself from the very thing that could save him: human connection, vulnerability, and the possibility of redemption. As Batman's journey continues, the deep psychological struggles that define his character become even more pronounced. His refusal to kill, which has served as a cornerstone of his identity, continues to be both a source of strength and a debilitating weakness. This code, while initially designed to prevent him from descending into the very chaos he fights against, ultimately becomes a psychological cage. Batman's unyielding adherence to his moral rule is both a means of survival and an expression of his inability to let go of the emotional trauma that has defined him since childhood. At the heart of Batman's refusal to kill is the belief that to kill would be to surrender to the same darkness that claimed his parents. This belief is rooted in his unprocessed grief and his overwhelming fear of becoming like the criminals he fights. Batman's moral code is an attempt to assert control over his life, to create a distinction between himself and the evildoers of Gotham. In a world filled with violence and corruption, his refusal to take a life represents the last bastion of order in a universe governed by chaos. But beneath this sense of order there lies a profound fear that in killing he would lose his identity, his humanity, and the very essence of what it means to be Batman. The fear of losing control over his emotions, his actions, and his identity is the root cause of Batman's self-imposed isolation. By adhering so rigidly to his moral code, Batman distances himself from those who could offer him emotional support or healing. His relationships, both personal and professional, suffer as a result. Batman's inability to form meaningful connections with others reflects the deep psychological damage that continues to haunt him. He cannot afford to trust others, to allow anyone to get too close, for fear that they might discover the vulnerable, broken man beneath the mask. The psychological cost of this emotional isolation is profound. Batman's need to be in control, to keep his emotions and his past at bay, prevents him from confronting the core of his trauma, the death of his parents. The pain of losing them has never truly been dealt with, and every time Batman is forced to confront that pain, whether in his interactions with Gotham's criminals or in the mirror, he is reminded of his inability to change the past. This unrelenting guilt, combined with his fear of vulnerability, keeps him locked in a psychological state of perpetual tension. Batman's refusal to kill is not just about justice. It is about his deep need to preserve his sense of self-control in the face of overwhelming emotional chaos. In Batman's mind, the act of killing would be the ultimate surrender to the darkness that he fears. But the irony lies in the fact that his refusal to kill is itself a manifestation of that darkness. By refusing to take a life, Batman ensures that he remains in a perpetual state of emotional stasis, the very act of denying himself closure, denying himself the ability to confront the deep-seated grief that defines his existence, forces him to carry the weight of his past indefinitely. His moral code, instead of freeing him, keeps him tethered to a past that he cannot change, unable to move forward or heal. This emotional stasis is particularly evident in Batman's relationship with the Joker. The Joker, as the embodiment of chaos and anarchy, represents the very forces that Batman fears. Yet, their relationship is not simply that of hero and villain. The Joker is a mirror to Batman, a distorted reflection of the darkness Batman believes exists within himself. The Joker's constant challenges to Batman's moral code are not merely about defeating him, they are about breaking him. The Joker seeks to push Batman to the brink, to force him to confront his deepest fears, that despite all his moral purity, he is just as capable of violence and destruction as the criminals he fights. What the Joker understands, that Batman refuses to acknowledge, is that the line between hero and villain is not as clear as Batman would like to believe. The Joker is relentless in his pursuit to expose the fragility of Batman's moral code, to show him that, beneath the mask of the Dark Knight, there is a man who is terrified of becoming the very thing he fights. The Joker's provocation, his attempt to force Batman to kill, is not just about chaos. It is about forcing Batman to reckon with the complexity of his own moral code and psychological condition. If Batman were to kill, it would mean that he had broken, that the darkness within him had finally consumed him. But by refusing to kill, Batman holds on to the illusion of control, and by doing so continues to push away the emotional healing he so desperately needs. The Joker's role in Batman's life is thus far more than that of an adversary. The Joker is a catalyst for Batman's internal conflict, a constant reminder that Batman's moral code is fragile and flawed. By pushing Batman to his limits, the Joker forces Batman to confront the very essence of who he is and why he adheres to his rigid code. The Joker's actions expose the psychological vulnerability that Batman is trying so hard to hide, and in doing so, forces Batman to face the truth. His refusal to kill is not just a moral choice, it is a defense mechanism, a psychological crutch designed to keep him from confronting the unbearable grief and guilt that he has spent his life suppressing. But despite all of the Joker's efforts, Batman remains steadfast. His refusal to kill, his unyielding moral code, continues to define him, even as it threatens to break him. The truth, however, is that Batman's moral code is not just about justice, it is about survival. Batman's need to maintain control, to refuse to kill, is a psychological necessity. It allows him to keep the darkness at bay, to prevent himself from becoming the very thing he fears. But in doing so, Batman traps himself in an endless cycle of repression, isolation, and guilt. The tragedy of Batman's situation is that despite all of his heroism, he is unable to free himself from the psychological chains that bind him. His moral code, rather than serving as a shield, becomes a cage, one that keeps him from healing, from finding peace, and from living a life beyond the trauma of his past. His refusal to kill, while it may seem like a noble act of justice, is in fact a desperate attempt to hold on to the only thing that makes him feel like he is in control. But this need for control prevents him from experiencing the emotional catharsis that could help him move beyond his past, beyond his trauma, and beyond the mask of the Dark Knight. Batman's story is ultimately a tragedy of psychological survival. He has built a life around his moral code, but that very code, designed to protect him, is the thing that keeps him trapped in a psychological prison. The Dark Knight, while an icon of justice and strength, is ultimately a man who is incapable of confronting his deepest fears and emotional scars. His refusal to kill is not an act of heroism, it is an act of survival, a way for him to preserve the illusion of control in a world that has stripped him of everything he once knew. And yet, despite all of this, Batman continues to fight. He continues to fight for justice, for Gotham, and for himself, even though he cannot seem to break free from the chains of his past. His moral code, though a psychological crutch, also defines him as a hero. But whether that definition is enough to bring him peace, to bring him healing, is a question that may never be answered. Batman's journey is not just one of crime fighting, but one of self-destruction and survival, constantly torn between the man he was and the man he fears he has become. As we peel back the layers of Batman's psyche, it becomes evident that his refusal to kill is not just a defining aspect of his moral compass, but a manifestation of the deep psychological rift within him. Batman's entire existence is anchored in his obsession with preventing the chaos and tragedy that marked his childhood. But this very obsession also holds him in a state of emotional paralysis. The idea of killing, of crossing that irreversible line, represents more than just a moral boundary for Batman. It represents his greatest fear, that by taking a life, he would lose the very thing that makes him Batman control. The paradox is that, by refusing to kill, Batman prevents himself from confronting his deeper fears, from confronting the emotional scars that threaten to overtake him. This fear of losing control, coupled with his belief that he must remain morally superior to the criminals he faces, forces Batman into a state of self-imposed emotional numbness. While Batman's refusal to kill might initially appear to be a noble act of justice, it becomes more and more clear that it is an act of self-preservation, a psychological defense mechanism. Batman cannot afford to break his moral code, because doing so would shatter the fragile control he has over his fractured self-identity. His refusal to kill, in effect, prevents him from acknowledging the raw emotions that would be unleashed if he allowed himself to confront his trauma, his grief, and his deep-seated guilt. This ongoing psychological struggle is not just a matter of moral purity, It is a matter of survival. Batman has created an identity built on the notion that he can save Gotham, that he can prevent further pain and suffering by adhering to a strict moral code. But in doing so, he has become so entrenched in his own psychological defenses that he is unable to truly heal from the trauma that has defined him. His refusal to kill is not just a choice, it is a psychological necessity. It is the only way he can maintain the illusion that he has some control over the world around him, that he is not as powerless as he was when he witnessed his parents' deaths. The consequence of this psychological strategy is Batman's continued emotional isolation. His moral code, which was meant to keep him grounded, has instead become a barrier between him and the world. Every time he chooses to follow his code, he distances himself further from the possibility of true emotional connection. Batman's relationships with those closest to him, Alfred, Robin, Rachel, are all marked by his emotional detachment. His inability to let others in, to allow them to see his vulnerabilities, means that he remains a solitary figure trapped in a cycle of emotional repression. Alfred, despite being a father figure to Bruce Wayne, is constantly pushed away. Even when Alfred offers guidance, support, and unconditional love, Batman cannot accept it. His need for control is so overpowering that he refuses to let anyone, even those who care for him the most, into the deepest parts of his emotional world. Batman believes that by keeping others at arm's length, he can protect them from the danger that comes with being close to him. However, this emotional distance only reinforces his feelings of guilt and loneliness. The more Batman isolates himself, the more he is consumed by the trauma he cannot escape. His relationship with Rachel Dawes is similarly stifled by his psychological defenses. Rachel, who represents the possibility of a life outside of the darkness of Gotham, offers Batman a chance at happiness, connection, and healing. But Batman cannot allow himself that. His need to remain emotionally distant from her, his refusal to let her into his world, reflects his fear that love and vulnerability would expose him to a deeper pain than he can bear. Rachel's presence, rather than being a source of healing, becomes another painful reminder of what Batman cannot have, a life outside of the darkness, free from the emotional burdens that define him. Batman's relationships, therefore, are not only hindered by his refusal to kill, but also by the emotional walls he has built around himself. He is a man constantly caught between his desire for connection and his fear of vulnerability. His moral code, designed to keep him morally pure and in control, ultimately prevents him from living a life where he can experience love, healing, and true human connection. The more he clings to his rules, the more he denies himself the very thing that could help him heal, the opportunity to confront his own humanity. The irony, of course, is that Batman's greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. His refusal to kill is what separates him from the criminals he faces, but it is also what keeps him trapped in a cycle of emotional repression. By denying himself the chance to heal, to move beyond his past, Batman continues to carry the weight of his trauma, never allowing himself the emotional release that could break the chains of his psychological prison. His fear of crossing the line into chaos, into the realm of the killers he hunts, prevents him from acknowledging the very real psychological cost of his mission. His moral code, instead of being a source of strength, becomes the mechanism that sustains his emotional torment. The Joker, in many ways, serves as the ultimate test of Batman's psychological limits. The Joker is the antithesis of everything Batman represents: chaos, unpredictability, and an utter disregard for moral boundaries. While Batman fights to maintain order, structure, and justice, the Joker embraces chaos and destruction. For the Joker, there are no rules, no moral codes, only the pursuit of pure anarchy. Their conflict, therefore, is not just about crime and punishment. It is about the very psychological foundation upon which Batman's identity is built. The Joker represents the chaos that Batman fears, the chaos that threatens to unravel the fragile psychological armor Batman has created. What the Joker understands, perhaps better than anyone, is that Batman's moral code is not a reflection of his inherent goodness, but a symptom of his trauma and fear. By pushing Batman to break his rule, to kill or let someone die, the Joker is attempting to force Batman to confront the darkness that lies within him. The Joker's ultimate goal is not just to destroy Gotham or Batman, but to expose the fragility of Batman's identity. He wants Batman to break, to acknowledge that his moral code is not the result of an inherent moral superiority, but a psychological defense against the overwhelming fear and guilt that have defined his life. As the Joker continues to challenge Batman's refusal to kill, he forces Batman to face the psychological reality of his situation, that despite all his strength and heroism, Batman is ultimately a man defined by his trauma. The Joker's manipulation is not about defeating Batman physically, it is about breaking him mentally. By pushing Batman to kill, the Joker seeks to strip away the very moral code that keeps Batman emotionally and psychologically stable. In doing so, the Joker hopes to expose the raw fear and vulnerability that Batman has spent his entire life trying to suppress. The Joker's manipulation ultimately forces Batman to confront his greatest fear, that his moral code is not a reflection of his heroic nature, but a psychological crutch designed to protect him from his own inner darkness. The more the Joker pushes Batman to break his rule, the more Batman is forced to confront the truth about himself, that he is not just a hero, but a man haunted by fear, guilt, and an inability to move beyond the trauma of his past. As we reach deeper into Batman's psyche, it becomes increasingly clear that his refusal to kill is both the foundation of his heroism and the very thing that traps him in his own psychological labyrinth. Batman's moral code, the strict adherence to never taking a life, stems from the trauma of his childhood, the night he lost his parents in a brutal act of violence. In his mind, taking a life would mean relinquishing the very thing that he believes separates him from the criminals he faces, his humanity. But this fear, this need to hold on to control, becomes a double-edged sword that imprisons Batman within the very code he swears by. The truth that Batman refuses to confront, the truth that lies beneath the mask of the Dark Knight, is that his refusal to kill is not simply a moral decision. It is a psychological defense mechanism. It is his way of coping with the grief, the guilt, and the helplessness he felt as a child, watching his parents die in a senseless act of violence. By refusing to kill, Batman tells himself that he is not like those he fights, that he remains untainted by the chaos of the criminal world. But in doing so, he prevents himself from addressing the very issues that make him who he is, a man deeply scarred by loss, consumed by guilt, and afraid to confront the pain that lies within. The question that Batman must ultimately face, one that he has avoided for years, was whether his moral code is a reflection of his true values, or simply a way to suppress the emotional turmoil he has never allowed himself to feel. As long as he continues to fight for justice without confronting his own inner darkness, Batman remains trapped in a cycle of self-denial. The longer he clings to his rigid moral stance, the more it becomes a prison, a psychological fortress that keeps him from healing, from growing, and from truly moving beyond the trauma that defines his existence. In many ways, the Joker serves as the catalyst that forces Batman to face this difficult truth. The Joker, as Batman's greatest nemesis, is not just a criminal mastermind, but a psychological mirror to Batman himself. The Joker embodies the chaos and anarchy that Batman so desperately fears. He is the antithesis of everything Batman represents: order, control, and morality. But the Joker is also a reflection of the very darkness that Batman is unwilling to confront. In his willingness to kill without hesitation, to embrace chaos and destruction, the Joker forces Batman to question the foundation of his own moral code. Is his refusal to kill a sign of moral clarity, or is it a psychological defense, a way to deny the very part of himself that he fears the most? The Joker's constant attempts to push Batman to break his rule by killing or allowing death are not merely acts of villainy, they are psychological tests meant to break down the walls that Batman has built around himself. Each time Batman refuses to kill, each time he upholds his code, he is reaffirming the psychological barriers that separate him from the vulnerability he so desperately fears. The Joker understands that Batman's refusal to kill is not just a moral choice, it is a psychological coping mechanism, a way to keep control over his own emotional landscape. By forcing Batman to confront the possibility of breaking that rule, the Joker is forcing Batman to confront the deep fear that lies at the core of his existence, the fear of losing himself, the fear of becoming what he fights against. The complexity of Batman's internal struggle comes from the realization that the very thing that makes him a hero, his refusal to kill, may also be the thing that prevents him from truly healing. His moral code, in its purity, becomes a cage, keeping him locked in the past. Every time he resists killing, every time he chooses to apprehend a criminal rather than take their life, he is perpetuating the emotional stasis that has defined his life for years. The refusal to kill becomes not just a moral code, but a psychological blockade, a way for Batman to prevent himself from confronting the overwhelming emotional pain that haunts him. What Batman fails to realize, however, is that by holding on to his moral code at all costs, he is refusing to accept the full complexity of the human experience, the possibility of imperfection, of mistakes, and of forgiveness. By refusing to kill, Batman denies himself the opportunity to truly let go of the past, to move beyond the trauma that shaped him. The act of forgiveness, both of himself and others, becomes impossible as long as he continues to live by his self-imposed rule. He has built an identity based on the rejection of violence, but that rejection has come at the expense of his own emotional well-being. Batman's refusal to kill is a refusal to accept the truth of human nature, that we are all capable of darkness, that we are all flawed. It is only by acknowledging this truth and accepting the full range of human experience that Batman can begin to heal. But in order to do so, he must first break free from the moral code that has kept him isolated and emotionally numb. The Joker's role in Batman's life is to force him to confront this truth. The Joker, with his complete rejection of moral boundaries, is a mirror to Batman's own fears and limitations. By challenging Batman to break his code, the Joker is not only testing his moral integrity, but also forcing Batman to question his own identity, his own fear of imperfection, and the very walls he has built around his heart. In confronting the Joker, Batman is ultimately confronting the truth about himself. The question that Batman must ask himself is whether his refusal to kill is truly about justice, or whether it is about self-preservation. Is his moral code a reflection of his noble nature, or is it a way to prevent himself from confronting the emotional chaos that lies within? Until Batman can answer this question, he will remain trapped in the cycle of repression and self-denial that has defined his life for so long. This internal struggle is the true essence of Batman's tragedy. He is a man defined by his trauma, fighting for justice, but never fully able to heal from the wounds that have shaped him. The mask of the Dark Knight, while it symbolizes his heroism, also symbolizes the emotional walls he has built around himself. Every time Batman chooses to uphold his moral code, he is reinforcing the isolation that prevents him from truly healing. The more he clings to his rules, the more he distances himself from the very possibility of redemption. The Joker's role, therefore, is not just to challenge Batman's rule, it is to challenge the very foundation of Batman's identity. If Batman were to break his code, if he were to kill, it would not only signify a moral failure, but would represent a psychological breakthrough. By breaking his code, Batman would be forced to confront the fear and guilt that have kept him trapped in his emotional prison for so long. It would be the first step toward healing, a healing that Batman desperately needs but has been too afraid to pursue. As we continue to delve into the intricate layers of Batman's psyche, we begin to see that his refusal to kill, while deeply ingrained in his moral identity, may ultimately be the psychological trap that keeps him from ever finding peace. Batman's journey is defined not just by the external battles he faces, but by the internal war that rages inside him. His refusal to take a life, born from a deep fear of becoming what he fights against, becomes both a source of strength and an enduring weakness, the very thing that keeps him tethered to his past, incapable of moving forward. The tragedy of Batman's refusal to kill lies in the fact that it stems from the very trauma that defines him. The night his parents were murdered, this defining moment, which propelled him into his mission to fight crime, has left Batman psychologically broken, incapable of healing. The trauma of losing his parents has haunted Batman for his entire life, and his moral code, his refusal to kill, is his desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable, to make sure that the chaos and violence that took his parents away will never have the same power over him again. But in doing so, he is forever chained to the very event he cannot change, unable to confront the grief and guilt that still linger deep within him. Batman's moral code is both a manifestation of his fear and his greatest psychological barrier. By refusing to kill, Batman believes he is holding on to his humanity, drawing a firm line between himself and the criminals he fights. He sees killing as the ultimate surrender to the chaos that destroyed his childhood, and so, by refusing to take a life, he tells himself that he is not like those he hunts. But in doing so, Batman creates an identity that is based on denial, repression, and fear. His refusal to kill is not born from a place of moral purity, but from a place of deep psychological fragility, an attempt to suppress the emotional chaos that threatens to overwhelm him. The longer he holds on to his code, the further he distances himself from the possibility of healing, of moving beyond the trauma that continues to define his life. In this way, Batman's moral code serves as a self-imposed prison. His refusal to kill keeps him locked in a cycle of emotional numbness, unable to truly confront his past or to heal from the wounds that define him. The code that he clings to, which he believes makes him different from the criminals he faces, becomes the very thing that prevents him from reconnecting with his humanity. By continually holding himself to this strict standard, Batman denies himself the opportunity for growth and emotional release. He remains frozen in time, perpetually stuck in the aftermath of his parents' deaths, unable to escape the cycle of guilt and fear that has shaped his life. This cycle is exemplified in his interactions with the people closest to him. Batman's relationships with those around him, Alfred, Robin, Rachel, are all strained by his emotional detachment. While he may care deeply for them, He cannot allow them into his world because to do so would mean exposing himself to vulnerability and emotional pain. His inability to trust others, to allow them to help him shoulder the weight of his mission, reflects his fear that he is not worthy of love, connection, or healing. This emotional isolation is not just a result of his commitment to justice, it is a reflection of the deep psychological walls he has built to protect himself from the very emotions that he fears will destroy him. The tragic irony of Batman's situation is that, despite all his efforts to protect Gotham, to bring justice to a city consumed by crime, he is unable to protect himself from the darkness within. His refusal to kill, which he sees as his defining moral choice, keeps him locked in a cycle of psychological self-destruction. The more he upholds his code, the more he isolates himself from others and from the emotional release he desperately needs. Batman's obsession with control, the need to keep the chaos at bay, prevents him from acknowledging his own vulnerability. And without acknowledging that vulnerability, Batman remains incapable of healing. His code, instead of being a source of strength, becomes a cage that keeps him trapped in a life of emotional repression and isolation. This isolation is particularly apparent in Batman's relationship with his greatest adversary, the Joker. The Joker, with his utter disregard for moral boundaries, represents the very chaos that Batman fears. But the Joker is more than just a villain. He is a reflection of the darkness within Batman himself. The Joker forces Batman to confront the truth about his own psyche, that his refusal to kill is not an act of moral righteousness, but a psychological crutch. By constantly pushing Batman to break his moral code, the Joker is not just challenging Batman's sense of justice. He is challenging the very foundation of Batman's identity. The Joker's goal is not merely to create chaos, but to expose Batman's greatest fear, that his moral code, his refusal to kill, is not an act of heroism, but a defense mechanism designed to protect him from the emotional chaos that lies within. The Joker's provocations force Batman to confront the possibility that he is not the hero he believes himself to be. Instead, he is a man whose greatest fear is becoming like the very criminals he fights. Batman's refusal to kill is a reflection of his fear of his own inner darkness, a fear that he will become consumed by the same forces of chaos and violence that took his parents' lives. This struggle between Batman and the Joker becomes the psychological crux of Batman's journey. The Joker seeks to break Batman's moral code not only to bring about destruction, but to expose the fragility of Batman's psyche. Batman's refusal to kill, which he sees as the defining characteristic of his heroism, is in fact a psychological defense against the trauma he has never truly faced. The Joker, in challenging Batman's code, forces him to acknowledge the fear and guilt that he has spent his entire life suppressing. By pushing Batman to kill, the Joker is not just testing his resolve, he is forcing Batman to confront the raw, unhealed wounds that lie beneath the mask. Ultimately, Batman's greatest struggle is not against the Joker or any of the criminals he faces, but against the psychological scars of his past. His refusal to kill is not just a moral decision, it is a manifestation of his fear and trauma. Batman is constantly fighting to maintain control, to hold on to the moral code that he believes separates him from the criminals he fights. But in doing so, he denies himself the opportunity to heal. His code becomes the very thing that keeps him trapped, unable to escape the cycle of guilt and emotional repression. The Joker's role in Batman's life is not just to challenge his moral code, it is to force Batman to confront the psychological cost of that code. By refusing to kill, Batman is avoiding the emotional release that comes with facing his past. He is avoiding the very vulnerability that would allow him to heal. And the more Batman holds on to his code, the more he isolates himself from the possibility of redemption. In the end, the greatest battle that Batman must face is not against the criminals of Gotham, but against the darkness within himself. His refusal to kill, while it may keep him morally pure, ultimately prevents him from healing and finding peace. In conclusion, the complexity of Batman's character lies in the intricate interplay between his moral code, his psychological trauma, and his unrelenting mission to save Gotham. His refusal to kill, while initially seen as a noble and heroic stance, serves as a manifestation of his deep-seated fear, guilt, and emotional repression. This code, forged from the traumatic loss of his parents, becomes both a source of his strength and a psychological prison, locking him in a cycle of self-imposed isolation and emotional numbness. Batman's battle is not just with the criminals of Gotham, but with himself, his need for control, his fear of vulnerability, and his inability to confront the pain of his past. The more he clings to his moral code, the further he distances himself from the possibility of healing. His relationships with others, whether with Alfred, Robin, or Rachel, are strained by his emotional detachment, and his refusal to kill isolates him from the emotional catharsis that could help him move forward. The Joker, as Batman's greatest adversary, is the catalyst that forces Batman to confront the fragility of his moral code and the darkness within. The Joker's attempts to break Batman are not only external challenges but psychological tests, forcing Batman to face his deepest fears that his moral code is not a mark of purity, but a defense mechanism against the chaos he fears will consume him. Batman's greatest challenge, ultimately, is not the Joker or any criminal. It is his own internal struggle, his refusal to let go of the past and embrace the vulnerability that would allow him to heal. Batman's refusal to kill, in the end, reflects a larger tragic truth about his psyche. While it may keep him morally distinct from the criminals he fights, it also serves to bind him to the very trauma he seeks to avoid. The deeper Batman goes in his fight for justice, the more he isolates himself from the possibility of redemption, healing, and human connection. His moral code, rather than being the foundation of his heroism, becomes the very thing that keeps him from finding peace and closure. In the end, Batman's journey is one of self-destruction and survival, as he battles not just against Gotham's criminals, but against the psychological scars of his past. His refusal to kill may keep him morally pure, but it also keeps him trapped in a cycle of emotional repression until Batman can confront the darkness within himself. Until he can face the trauma and guilt that define him, he will remain a man caught between the need for control and the fear of losing himself. Batman, the Dark Knight, remains a tragic figure, not because of his strength or heroism, but because he is ultimately a man unable to heal, forever haunted by the trauma of his past and the fear that he may never be able to break free from it.